The heat shield peeled away in strips of orange and gold, and senior botanist Yale Torvin pressed her face closer to the descent pod's viewport until the condensation from her breath fogged the lower edge of the glass. Below, through the rippling curtain of plasma still curling around the hull, the planet turned from black to blue to green in a sequence that made no sense against her briefing files. Green, 60,000 years after the Serath Dominion had stripped this world of its last industrial capacity, salted the topsoil across 3 continents, and filed the termination report that classified Earth as a Category 1 sterile remnant. The planet below was green. The pod shuddered as the lower atmosphere caught it. Yale gripped the crash bar above her station and watched the viewport clear, the plasma fading, the sky resolving from white-hot to a pale, clean blue that reminded her of nothing in Serath space. Serath skies were amber. Serath clouds carried a particulate sheen that gave even the clearest day a kind of metallic gloss. This sky was naked, empty, the blue of water seen from a great height, somehow overhead instead of below. Descent stable, the pod's navigation system announced. Landing zone confirmed. No active targeting detected. No active targeting. The phrase should have been a comfort. Instead, it landed in the silence of the pod like a question nobody had asked yet. Why would a dead world need to target anything? Behind Yale, the other 5 members of the botanical survey team sat in their harnesses without speaking. She could feel their attention on the viewport, on the same impossible color, each of them arriving independently at the same problem. They had spent 4 years in transit reading the termination file. They had memorized its conclusions. They had built their entire research proposal around the certainty that Earth was dead, that whatever biological remnants might be recovered from the salted soil would provide the Serath Dominion's agricultural senate with data on pre-industrial photosynthesis, and that the expedition would return home with sealed sample cases and academic publications, and nothing else. Nobody had briefed them on green. The pod dropped through a cloud layer, and the landscape opened beneath them like a wound turning inside out to reveal something living where there should have been scar tissue. Mountains first high, sharp, snow-capped, the kind of aggressive tectonic structure that suggested a planet still geologically active. Then valleys between them, and in those valleys forests, not the sparse scrub of a recovering ecosystem. Forests. Dense canopy, layered understory visible even from altitude, the particular dark green that only comes from mature growth with deep root systems and decades of uninterrupted water access. That canopy is continuous, murmured Specialist Oren from the seat behind her. His voice was thin. Yale. That is continuous canopy cover for at least 800 kilometers. She did not answer. She was looking at something worse. Beyond the mountains, visible now as the pod descended through the last 10,000 meters of altitude, the forest gave way to something else. The green did not stop, it changed. It became ordered, geometric, rows and curves and spiraling patterns that no natural process produced, stretching across a valley so wide that its far edge dissolved into haze, and rising from the center of that ordered green structures. Not ruins, not the collapsed remnants of whatever humanity had built before the Dominion ended them. These were whole, these were enormous. Towers of a pale material that caught the late morning sunlight and held it, their surfaces textured in ways that suggested growth rather than construction, as though something had been planted and had risen to a height of 300 meters through patience rather than engineering. The pod's altimeter ticked down, 8,000 meters, 6-4. Survey command, this is Descent Pod 3. Yale's voice was steady. She was proud of that. Requesting confirmation of landing coordinates. The surface does not match the termination file. A pause. Then Commander Heth Vasari's voice, tight and controlled from the survey vessel in orbit above. Pod 3, we are seeing the same data you are. The orbital scans have been revised 7 times since your launch. Land as planned. Conduct preliminary soil sampling. Do not interact with any structures. Do not deviate from the sampling grid. Do not interact with any structures. The instruction carried a weight that told Yale the commander was as frightened as she was, but unlike her, he had military training and a fleet to think about. She had soil probes and a team of 5 botanists who had signed up to study dead dirt. Understood, Survey Command. Pod 3 descending to grid. The pod set down in a meadow. Yale knew it was a meadow because there was no other word for it. Open grass, knee-high, rippling in a wind that the pod's external sensors registered at 12 kilometers per hour from the southwest, carrying a temperature of 19 degrees and a humidity level that the Sereth Environmental Index would classify as optimal for broadleaf photosynthetic organisms. The grass was real. The wind was real. 60,000 years after the salting, Earth had grass. The ramp lowered and the smell hit her before anything else. Rich, layered. The particular density of biological scent that only came from soil that was alive, not preserved, not fossilized, not maintained by artificial means, but alive the way soil was alive, teeming with microbial activity and decomposition, and the slow, patient chemistry of roots exchanging nutrients in darkness. Yale stepped off the ramp, and her boots sank 2 centimeters into earth that gave beneath her weight like something offering rather than collapsing. The grass bent around her ankles. A small winged organism, an insect, her training supplied, though the word felt alien in her mind, lifted from a stem near her foot and circled once before disappearing into the meadow. Begin grid sampling, she said, and her voice sounded like someone else's. The team moved into the meadow in their assigned pattern, deploying soil probes at 10-meter intervals, collecting surface biomass, running spectrographic analyses on the grass itself. Yale moved with them, but her attention kept sliding sideways, toward the edge of the meadow where the ordered green began, where the rows curved, and the structures rose, and everything that should not exist waited in the morning light like a sentence no one had finished speaking. 20 minutes into the sampling grid, Specialist Thea called from her station 30 meters east. Yale, the grass is not a monoculture. She was kneeling, her sampling kit open around her, her atmospheric probe forgotten in the soil beside her. I am counting 17 distinct grass species in a 2-meter radius. 17. And they are arranged in a distribution pattern that optimizes ground coverage across all 4 seasons. This meadow does not go dormant. It grows year-round. A designed ecosystem, not recovered, designed. Yale acknowledged and moved to the next probe point, driving the sampler into the soil with more force than necessary, watching the core extract in its segmented tray with the focus of someone trying very hard not to look at the thing that frightened them most. The cores came up rich and dark and layered topsoil, subsoil, mineral substrate, and every one of them was wrong. The topsoil was too deep. The microbial count was too high. The nutrient density exceeded anything in the Sereth agricultural database by a factor of 3. 40 minutes in, Specialist Oren called her over. He was kneeling beside his 3rd probe insertion point, his sampling tools forgotten on the ground beside him, staring at the soil with an expression Yale had never seen on his face in 12 years of working together. He looked like a man who had opened a familiar door and found a cathedral behind it. "Look at this," he said. Yale knelt beside him. The probe had gone down 40 centimeters, the standard depth for topsoil assessment, and the core it had extracted was laid out on the sampling tray in its segmented sections. Topsoil dark and rich. Subsoil lighter, clay-heavy. Expected, but at the 30-centimeter mark something else. A layer of white powder compressed by 60,000 years of weight above it, but still distinct, still identifiable. Salt. The Dominion salt. The sterilization compound that had been dropped from orbit across 3 continents in a saturation pattern, designed to ensure nothing would grow on this world for 100,000 years. It was still there, undisturbed, still toxic, still chemically active. Oren's spectrometer confirmed that, The salt layer was intact, and above it, 30 centimeters of living soil. The root systems go through it, Orrin said. His voice was barely a whisper. Yale, look. The roots penetrate the salt layer. They go through it and into the substrate below. Something engineered its own root system to process the salt and keep growing. Yale stared at the core sample. The roots were visible in the cross-section, pale thread-like structures passing through the white layer without apparent damage, as though the toxin designed to kill every photosynthetic organism on the planet had become, over 60,000 years, just another mineral to process. Not by accident. Evolution did not work that fast, not on a planet that had been reduced to zero biomass. Something had been engineered. Something had been planted after the salting, designed to survive it, designed to grow through it, designed to reclaim this world one root system at a time while the Dominion spent 60 millennia assuming its work was finished. Mark this site, Yale said. Full extraction. I want the entire column preserved. She pulled a second core from the adjacent meter. Same result. Salt layer at 30 centimeters. Roots penetrating cleanly, living soil above. A third core, 2 meters further, identical. The salt was everywhere beneath them, a continuous stratum of concentrated poison that should have kept this meadow sterile for another 40,000 years. And above it, as casually as grass growing through a sidewalk crack, life had simply decided to continue. Every core, Orrin said. He was pulling samples rapidly now, his earlier paralysis replaced by the frantic energy of a scientist watching his entire theoretical framework dissolve in real time. Every single core shows the same thing. The salt layer is planetary. It is continuous, and the root systems treat it like bedrock. They anchor in it. Some of them appear to be metabolizing the compound itself, converting the salt ions into structural minerals for their own growth. They had turned the weapon into food. Yale stood and looked toward the tree line, toward the ordered rows beyond it, toward the structures that rose above the canopy like fingers pointing at a sky they had reclaimed without permission. She understood now what she was looking at. Not a wild recovery, not a miraculous accident of nature finding a way. A garden. The entire valley was a garden, planted, tended, engineered from the soil up by a species the Dominion had classified as terminated, working in silence for 60,000 years to undo what had been done to them. The comms crackled. Pod 3 survey command. We are detecting energy signatures from the structures in your valley. Low output, consistent with residential power distribution, not military. No weapons signatures, but the commander wants you to be aware. Acknowledged survey command. Residential power. People lived there. People with engineered soil and continuous forest canopy and structures that grew from the ground like something planted rather than built. People who had never sent a signal, never announced their survival, never contacted anyone in the wider galaxy to say they were still here. They had just kept gardening. Yale made a decision. She keyed her comm. Survey command, I am deviating from the sampling grid. I am proceeding on foot toward the nearest ordered vegetation zone. Botanical assessment priority. I will maintain comms throughout. A long pause. Then Commander Vasari, Pod 3, you were instructed to remain on grid. Commander, with respect, the grid was designed for dead soil. The soil is not dead. The mission parameters have changed. I need to see what is growing in those rows. Another pause. Longer. She could hear someone speaking in the background, Vasari consulting with the tactical officer, probably, weighing the risk of letting a botanist walk into a living forest against the risk of pulling back, without understanding what this world had become. Proceed, Pod 3. Do not approach the structures. Do not make contact. Observe and record only. Understood. Yale walked. Orrin fell in beside her without being asked, and after a moment, Specialist Thea joined them, her atmospheric sampling kit slung over one shoulder, her eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. The rest of the team stayed with the pod, continuing the grid, their movements mechanical and distracted as they processed what the soil cores were telling them. The meadow ended at a clean edge, not the ragged boundary of competing biomes, but a deliberate margin, a strip of low ground cover between the open grass and the first row of trees that reminded Yale of the buffer zones in Serath agricultural facilities. A designed transition. Someone had planned where the meadow stopped and the forest began. The trees were enormous. Yale's head tipped back as she entered their shade, and the canopy closed above her, filtering the morning light into a green-gold pattern on the forest floor. The trunks were wider than she was tall, their bark a deep reddish-brown, their lower branches beginning 15 meters above the ground. The air changed immediately cooler, damper, rich with the smell of decomposition and growth in equal measure. Her atmospheric sensors registered the shift. Oxygen concentration up 0.2%, carbon dioxide down by a proportional amount. The trees were working, actively cycling. She could almost hear it in the silence, the vast quiet machinery of photosynthesis operating at a scale she had never encountered. And between the trees, growing in the shade with the patient confidence of something that had been here for centuries, the first of the cultivated plants. She stopped walking. Oren stopped beside her. Thea made a small sound. The plants grew in rows. Not strict military rows, curved rows, following the contour of the ground, adapting to the terrain while maintaining a spacing so consistent that it could only have been intentional. Each plant stood about 1 meter tall, broad-leafed, heavy with some kind of fruit that hung in clusters beneath the leaf canopy. The leaves were a green so dark they were almost black, photosynthetically aggressive, evolved or designed to capture every photon that made it through the forest canopy above. Between the rows, the ground was covered in a low creeping vine that bore small white flowers, and Yale's training told her immediately what she was looking at: a nitrogen-fixing ground cover. A companion plant. Something grown alongside the fruit-bearing species specifically to enrich the soil and suppress competition. This was not wild growth. This was agriculture. Sophisticated, shade-adapted, multi-species agriculture operating beneath a forest canopy without any visible tending infrastructure. "Where are the machines?" Thea said. "Where are the irrigation systems? Where are the harvest crews?" Yale did not answer. She was counting rows. She could see at least 40 from where she stood, curving away into the green distance beneath the trees, each one bearing fruit at the same stage of ripeness, each one maintaining the same spacing from its neighbors. The forest floor beneath them was clean, no dead wood, no fallen fruit, no unharvested excess. Something maintained this. Something kept it in order. She knelt beside the nearest plant and touched one of the leaves. It was warm. Not from sunlight, the shade was too deep for that. Warm from metabolic activity. The plant was producing heat. That was not a property of any photosynthetic organism in the Serath database. Plants did not produce heat. They absorbed energy. They did not radiate it. Unless they had been designed to. Her hand was still on the leaf when the ground beneath her shifted. Not violently, a gentle settling, the kind of movement that happens when soil adjusts to a new weight on its surface. But it traveled. She felt it move outward from her touch point, through the root network below, spreading in a wave she could track by the faint vibration in the soles of her boots. The plants around her shifted their leaves. Not wind-driven, there was no wind beneath the canopy. They moved independently, angling toward her, and for one terrible, beautiful moment, the entire row of plants turned their broad, dark leaves in her direction as though looking at her. Then the movement stopped. The plants settled back into their resting positions. The vibration beneath her feet faded. "Yale," Oren said. He was standing very still, his hands at his sides, his face pale behind his environmental visor. "The root network, it is networked. The whole forest is one system." She stood slowly. "I know. It felt us arrive. I know." Thea was running scans, her hands trembling slightly as she directed her atmospheric probe toward the soil between the rows. The vibration carried information, she said. I registered a modulated pattern in the subsurface frequencies. Not random, structured. It was communicating. Our arrival just propagated through the network. The entire forest knew they were here. Every root, every tree, every cultivated row in this valley had just received a signal that said, something new has arrived. The comms crackled again. Vasari's voice. And this time, there was something in it that Yale had not heard before, a quality of controlled alarm that military commanders reserved for situations where calm was more dangerous than honest fear. Pod 3, we are receiving data from our orbital survey drones. The pattern you are standing in the cultivated rows beneath forest canopy, it extends beyond your valley. Significantly beyond. How far, Commander? A silence that lasted 4 seconds too long. The current estimate, based on spectral analysis and heat mapping, is that continuous cultivated agriculture beneath engineered canopy covers approximately 62% of the planetary land surface. Yale closed her eyes. 62%. 62% of a planet's land area, cultivated beneath forest, maintained without visible machinery, fed by engineered soil that had grown through 60,000 years of Dominion salt to reclaim itself from sterility. The scale of it broke something in her mind, not her composure, which held, but her framework, her understanding of what a terminated species was supposed to be capable of. Commander, she said, I do not believe this planet is uninhabited. No, botanist, neither do we. The fleet has revised its threat assessment 3 times in the last 20 minutes. We are not detecting weapons platforms or orbital defense systems. We are not detecting military infrastructure of any kind. What we are detecting is a pause. Residential energy signatures across the cultivated zones, dispersed, low density, consistent with approximately 11 billion individual dwelling units. 11 billion. The pre-termination population estimate in the Dominion's file had been 8 billion. The planet they had killed had come back, and there were more of them now than before. They are not hailing us, Vasari said. They are not targeting us. They are not acknowledging our presence in any way we can detect, but they are there, and they have been there based on the root system dating from your soil cores for at least 58,000 years. 58,000 years. Growing, rebuilding, reclaiming, in silence, without ever reaching out to the galaxy that had salted their world and left them to die. They had turned inward instead of outward, and they had made their planet into something the Dominion could not have imagined with the full resources of the Agricultural Senate. Yale opened her eyes and looked at the forest around her with new understanding. This was not wilderness. This was not even agriculture in the way she understood it. This was civilization expressed as a garden. The structures she had seen from the air were not built on the land, they were part of it, grown from it, integrated with the root network and the canopy and the soil in a way that erased the distinction between dwelling and landscape. The entire planet was the infrastructure. Every tree, every cultivated row, every meter of engineered soil was both food production and home and power system and communication network. All at once, 62% of the world's surface transformed into a single living system, with 11 billion people woven through it like threads in a fabric. Thea, Yale said, run atmospheric analysis, full spectrum. I want planetary composition numbers. Thea was already working, her sampling kit deployed, the readouts scrolling across her forearm display. She took 3 separate measurements, cross-referenced them against the pod's baseline reading from descent, and then stood absolutely still as the results resolved. The atmosphere is engineered, she said. Carbon dioxide at 280 parts per million. Exactly 280. Oxygen at 21.4%. Exactly 21.4. Nitrogen at 78.1. These are not natural equilibrium numbers for a planet with this level of biomass. These are maintained numbers. Something is actively regulating the atmospheric composition at a planetary scale. How is that possible? Oren asked. Atmospheric regulation at that precision would require processing capacity equivalent to 62% of a planet's surface area in active photosynthetic biomass operating as a single coordinated system, Yale said, which is exactly what we are standing inside. A planetary-scale life support system grown from the ground up. Yale understood now why there were no orbital defense platforms, no warships parked in the upper atmosphere, no weapon signatures that the fleet could detect. This civilization did not defend itself with weapons. It defended itself with roots, with patience, with 60,000 years of quiet engineering that had turned their own dead soil into something so complex, so deeply integrated, so fundamentally alive that any attack on the surface would be an attack on the defense system itself. You could not bomb a garden that was also the people. You could not salt the soil when the soil had learned to eat the salt. Commander Vasari, Yale said into the calm. I need to ask a question that may sound strange. At this point, botanist, nothing will sound strange. The fleet's hull sensors, are they registering any particulate contact, specifically biological particulate spores, pollen, anything airborne with organic markers? A 20-second pause. Then Vasari's voice, carefully controlled. The hull maintenance officers have flagged an anomaly. A fine green particulate is accumulating on the exterior sensor arrays of 4 vessels. It was initially classified as atmospheric debris. It began approximately 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes, the same duration since their pod had entered the atmosphere. Commander, that is not debris. I believe the planetary route network has an atmospheric distribution system, spore-based or pollen-based. It detected our fleet's hull composition the moment we entered the atmosphere, and it is sampling your vessels. It is learning what you are made of. A long silence from orbit. Yale could imagine the looks being exchanged on the command deck. Is it harmful? Vasari asked. I doubt it. Nothing on this planet has been hostile, but it is thorough. Commander, I want to be very clear about what I am telling you. This route network is not a farm. It is not even a city. It is a planetary immune system. It identifies foreign bodies, it classifies them, and based on what I am seeing at the surface, it has had 60,000 years to develop its response protocols. If it decided your fleet was harmful, you would already know. Your assessment is that it has classified us as non-threatening. Yale looked at the plants around her. Their leaves had settled into a neutral position, not angled toward her team, not angled away, simply present, acknowledging. My assessment is that it has classified us as irrelevant, which, Commander, may be worse. The ground shifted again, gentle, a settling wave that moved through the route network from a direction Yale could not identify, passing beneath them, continuing onward. The plants around them adjusted their leaves again, but this time the movement was different, less alert, more welcoming, as though the network had assessed them and decided they were not a threat, not because they lacked weapons, but because no weapon they carried could matter to something this large. We should go back to the pod, Oren said. Yale shook her head, not yet. She turned in a slow circle, mapping the canopy architecture above with her eyes. Between the great trunks, something caught the light differently, a thin gleam of water, barely visible against the dark bark, running in a vertical channel down the interior of the nearest tree. Not sap, not condensation. Water, moving upward through an external groove carved into the bark with a precision that no insect or weather pattern could have produced. Oren, look at this. He followed her gaze. The water channel was narrow, perhaps a centimeter wide, 2 millimeters deep, and it spiraled up the trunk from the soil line into the canopy. At its base, where the channel emerged from the earth, the surrounding root mat was slightly raised, forming a collection basin no larger than Yale's palm. Rainwater would gather there, be absorbed into the channel, and climb the trunk by capillary action alone. No pump, no mechanism, just the physics of water in a narrow space, drawn upward by the same force that moved fluid through the roots themselves. It is an irrigation system, Yale breathed, built into the trees. The trees are the infrastructure. She moved to the next trunk, the same channel spiraling in the opposite direction. The next present again, but branching at the 10-meter mark, one channel continuing up while the other diverted horizontally along a branch, following the limb out toward the canopy edge where the light was strongest, where the cultivated plants below would need the most moisture. A gravity-fed distribution network built into the structural supports of the canopy itself, invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. Every tree is a water tower, Orrin said. His scanner was running continuous spectral analysis, data scrolling faster than he could read. The channels are not natural. The cell structure at the groove walls has been modified, compressed, hydrophobic on the outer edge, hydrophilic on the inner. Someone engineered the tree's bark to create these channels during growth. It is not carved in afterward. The tree grows the channel as part of its own development. Genetic engineering so deep that the infrastructure was hereditary. The trees reproduced, and their offspring grew the same water channels, in the same spiraling pattern, without any external instruction. The design had been written into their genome and left to propagate for millennia. Yale's comm buzzed. Vasari. Pod 3, new data from the orbital survey. The team at Pod 1 they set down on the northern continent in what the termination file designates as a salt flat region. They are reporting the same findings. Living soil above an intact salt layer. Continuous forest canopy, cultivated understory. Identical water channel architecture in the tree bark. The same pattern. Identical, the same genetic modifications, the same spiral orientation, the same branch point spacing. Pod 1's botanist estimates the northern continent's forests share a common ancestor with yours, dating to approximately 58,000 years before present. A single strain of engineered trees, released from a single point of origin, probably this valley, probably near this greenhouse, and allowed to spread across a continent, then another continent, then the planet. Not by planting each tree individually, by engineering the trees to plant themselves. To reproduce, to spread, to carry the water channel modification and the salt metabolizing roots and the photosynthetic regulation into every new generation, expanding across the dead land at the speed of growth. A few centimeters a year, for 60,000 years. That was all it took to reclaim a planet if you were patient enough to wait. Commander, Yale said, how many pods are on the surface? 4 of 6 deployed. Pods 2 and 5 remain in the hangar. Deploy them. Different continents. I need to know if the forest architecture is uniform globally or if there are regional variations. I need to know how many original planting points there were. And I need to know if the root network communication we detected extends between continents, or if each landmass operates independently. A pause. That is an expansion of the survey parameters beyond my authorization. Commander, with great respect, we came here to study dead soil. We are standing inside the most sophisticated biological engineering project in the known galaxy. If the Dominion's Agricultural Senate receives my preliminary data without full planetary documentation, they will send a second expedition with 10 times the personnel and none of the caution. I would rather document it properly now than watch a follow-up team damage what took 60,000 years to build. Vasari was silent for 8 seconds, then, deploying pods 2 and 5. Southern and western continents respectively. You will have cross-continental data within the hour. Thank you, Commander. Yale turned back to the forest. The water channels gleamed faintly on the trunks around her, each one a thread in a distribution network so elegant that the Serath Dominion's best hydrological engineers could not have designed it from scratch. And this was just the water system, just one layer of the integrated architecture. How many other systems were woven into these trees that she had not yet noticed? How many functions were encoded in their genomes, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew what to look for? She walked deeper into the rows. There was another discovery waiting 60 meters in. Thea found it a section of canopy where the trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking above a shallow depression in the forest floor. In the depression, water collected a pool perhaps 2 meters across, perfectly circular, its edges lined with a dense mat of small flowering plants that glowed faintly in the deep shade. Bioluminescent. The pool is filtered, Thea reported, her scanner dipped to the water surface. Zero particulate matter, zero microbial contamination. The flowering plants at the margin are producing antimicrobial compounds continuously. This is a drinking water station, self-purifying, self-maintaining, requiring no infrastructure beyond the plants themselves. A public fountain grown from seeds, placed where the canopy was thickest and the shade was deepest, where foot traffic would naturally concentrate during the hottest part of the day. Someone had thought about human comfort, about where a person walking through this forest would become thirsty, and what they would find when they arrived at that point. Every detail was intentional. Every element served multiple functions. The bioluminescent flowers were not just beautiful, they were antimicrobial. The dense canopy overhead was not just shade, it concentrated moisture for the pool. The depression in the earth was not an accident of terrain, it was a catchment, shaped by root architecture below the surface to direct groundwater upward at this precise point. I am counting 3 more pools visible from here, Oren said, pointing through the trees, each approximately the same distance apart, 60 to 70 meters. Spaced for human walking pace. 1 pool for every minute of travel through the forest. An entire planet's worth of drinking water, purified and provided, without a single pipe or treatment plant or distribution grid. Just plants doing what they had been designed to do, growing where they had been placed, serving the people who walked among them as they had served every generation for tens of thousands of years. She walked deeper into the rows. The fruit was everywhere, heavy clusters hanging beneath the dark leaves, and as she walked she noticed that no 2 rows bore the same species. Each curve of cultivated plants was different. Different leaf shapes, different fruit types, different heights and growth patterns, all sharing the same engineered soil and nitrogen-fixing ground cover, but each adapted to a slightly different microclimate within the canopy. The biodiversity was staggering. Hundreds of species in a single hectare, all growing in apparent cooperation, none competing, each filling a specific niche in the vertical architecture of the forest. A polycultural system, every row a different crop, every row placed precisely where its requirements, light, water, soil chemistry, were naturally met by the architecture of the forest above it. No energy wasted on irrigation. No energy wasted on pest suppression. The system suppressed its own pests through diversity, fed itself through nitrogen fixation, maintained its own soil through the continuous cycling of organic matter. Self-sustaining, self-replicating, and old. Unimaginably old. Oren stopped beside a fruit-bearing plant and ran his scanner over a cluster. "These fruits are nutritionally complete," he said. "Every amino acid, every mineral required for large mammal metabolism. A single cluster would sustain an adult human for 2 days." He moved to the next row, scanned again. "This one is different. High-density caloric content fats and complex carbohydrates." And this one he moved again. Medicinal compounds. Anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, cell regeneration triggers. He straightened and looked at Yale. "This is not agriculture. This is a pharmacy and a granary, and a habitat all growing in the same hectare." The Dominion's Agricultural Senate spent its annual budget trying to achieve efficient food production on colony worlds. They terraformed. They imported soil. They engineered crops in sterile laboratories and deployed them in monoculture fields that required constant maintenance. Their best facilities produced enough food for 6 million citizens per square kilometer of dedicated farmland. This forest produced enough for 11 billion while also being the homes, the power grid, the communication network, and the defense system. And it had been doing it without a single piece of visible machinery for 60,000 years. Yale stopped when she reached the clearing. It was not large, perhaps 40 meters across, a break in the canopy where the trees drew back and the sky showed through in a circle of clean blue. In the center of the clearing stood a single structure, and looking at it, Yale felt the same feeling she had seen on Oren's face beside the soil probe, the feeling of opening a familiar door and finding a cathedral. It was a greenhouse, made of something transparent and faintly luminous, rising in a graceful curve from the forest floor, its walls alive with condensation, its interior dense with green. But it was old, impossibly old. The base of the structure was buried in 2 meters of accumulated soil, its lower panels green with the same moss that covered the surrounding trees, its frame weathered by millennia of rain and wind, until it had become more a part of the forest than apart from it. And inside, visible through the condensation-fogged panels, rows of small pots, hundreds of them, arranged on shelves that climbed the interior walls in ascending spirals, each pot containing a single plant, each plant labeled with a tag that Yale could not read from outside but could see clearly enough to know it was writing. Text. Language. Someone had written labels for these plants and placed them here, in this greenhouse, in this clearing, in the center of a cultivated forest that covered 62% of a planet. A seed bank, a nursery, the beginning of everything she was standing in. Oren, date the frame material. He scanned, ran the analysis twice, looked at her. 59,400 years, give or take a century. 2,000 years after the salting. Someone had survived. Someone had gathered materials. Someone had built this structure in a dead landscape, sheltered from the poison outside, and begun the work of growing something in soil that had been designed to kill everything it touched. They had started here, in this clearing, in this greenhouse, with whatever seeds they had managed to save or engineer or coax from the ruin the Dominion had made of their world. This was where it had started, the first planting after the salting. Someone, some human, 59,000 years ago, standing in dead soil beneath a poisoned sky, had built a greenhouse and started growing things, one seed at a time, testing which roots could penetrate the salt, testing which leaves could filter the ruined air, testing, failing, testing again, with the patient certainty that the soil could be reclaimed if you were willing to spend longer reclaiming it than it had taken to destroy it. 60,000 years, starting with a greenhouse in a dead field, ending with a planet. The pots on the lower shelves, Thea said. She had pressed her face against the glass, peering through the condensation. They are empty. Just soil in the containers. But the soil is different colors, white in some, gray in others, pure black in the newest ones. I think they were tests. Each pot was a different soil composition, seeing what could survive the salt at various concentrations. Failed experiments on the lower shelves. Successes higher up, where the living plants grew. A record of trial and error written in clay and soil and patience, stretching back to the first terrible year when someone decided to fight extinction not with weapons but with seeds. Pod 3, Survey Command. Vasari's voice was quieter now. The urgency had drained out of it, replaced by something that sounded like awe held carefully at arm's length. We are observing movement in the structures near your position. Several individuals have emerged. They appear to be walking in your direction. They are unarmed. They are moving at a casual pace. No hostility indicated. Yale turned. Through the trees at the far edge of the clearing she could see them. 3 figures, walking between the cultivated rows with the easy familiarity of people who had walked this ground 10,000 times before. They were taller than Serath, which surprised her, because the Dominion's file had listed the species as short-statured. 60,000 years of nutritional abundance, she realized. Generations growing up in this garden, fed by engineered soil, breathing engineered air. They had changed. They wore no armor, no weapons. Their clothing was simple, woven from something that looked like plant fiber, dyed in shades of green and brown that made them part of the landscape they walked through. Their skin was dark from sun exposure. Their hands were large, gardener's hands. One of them, a woman, older, gray-haired, her face lined with the particular patience of someone who had spent decades watching things grow, carried a small plant in a clay pot. She walked toward the greenhouse in the clearing without apparent concern for the three aliens standing beside it, as though visitors from the species that had salted her world 60,000 years ago were simply another thing happening in a day full of things happening, no more remarkable than the wind changing direction or a fruit ripening on its stem. "Commander," Yale said into her comm, "they are here, 3 of them, unarmed. One is carrying a plant." A long silence from orbit. Then, "Botanist, what is your assessment?" "Stand by." Yale watched the woman walk toward the greenhouse. The 2 others, a younger man and what appeared to be an adolescent, perhaps his child, stopped at the edge of the clearing and leaned against the trunks of the great trees, watching the proceedings with mild interest. Not alarm, not hostility. The detached curiosity of people observing something that did not threaten them and therefore did not require urgency. The woman reached the greenhouse entrance, a low door, half hidden by moss and climbing vine, and opened it with one hand, the pot balanced on her other palm. She stepped inside, moved to an empty space on the second shelf between 2 other pots, and set her burden down with the careful precision of someone placing a thing exactly where it belonged. Her movements were unhurried, practiced. She had done this before, perhaps thousands of times over the course of her life, adding one more plant to a collection that had been growing for 60 millennia. Then the woman turned and looked at Yale through the greenhouse wall, through 60,000 years of glass and silence and salt and reclamation. Her expression was not hostile, it was not afraid, it was not welcoming exactly. It was patient. The same patience that had grown a planet from a single seed. She held Yale's gaze for a long moment, then reached into the pocket of her woven garment and produced a small tag, identical to the ones on the other pots. She wrote something on it with a stylus bent, and placed it in the soil of the pot she had just set down. Then she straightened, nodded once at Yale through the glass, and walked back out through the door. The nod was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what you are. I am not afraid of you. Watch if you like." "My assessment, Commander," Yale said slowly, "is that they have been expecting us. Not with weapons, not with defenses. They have been expecting us with exactly what they used to survive. Patience. Certainty. The knowledge that whatever we bring, they have faced worse and grown through it." "And the fleet, Botanist, what does the fleet do?" The woman emerged from the greenhouse and joined her companions at the clearing's edge. The younger man said something to her, quiet, conversational, the tone of someone discussing the weather or the day's chores. She answered. They turned together and began walking back along the cultivated rows, the adolescent trailing slightly behind, reaching up to touch a hanging fruit as they passed beneath it. A family, going home. The fleet in orbit was not even a topic of discussion for them. Yale understood now what the Dominion's termination file had missed. It had measured industrial capacity, military potential, technological output on a timeline that Serath civilization recognized. And by those measures, 60,000 years ago, the humans had been dying. Their factories had been crumbling. Their armies had been fragments. Their technology had been primitive by galactic standards. But those were not the measures that mattered. The measure that mattered was the one the file had never thought to take, the willingness to plant a seed in dead soil and wait for it to grow. The willingness to invest not years or decades but millennia in a single act of faith That if you put something living into something dead and you tended it, and you waited and your children waited and their children waited, eventually the living thing would win. Not through force, through persistence. Through the patient chemical certainty that roots grow and salt dissolves and life, given enough time, eats everything that tried to kill it. The fleet does nothing, Commander. The fleet observes. The fleet learns. And then the fleet goes home and tells the Dominion what 60,000 years of patience looks like when it finishes. The Senate will want more than that, botanist. Then tell them this. Tell them that the root network beneath this planet's surface is currently processing atmospheric data from their hull sensors. Tell them that it classified our fleet within 40 minutes of atmospheric entry. Tell them that it chose not to respond. And tell them to consider very carefully what it means when a planetary organism capable of coordinating 11 billion people decides that your fleet is not worth noticing. Vasari was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, the military certainty had been stripped from his voice like bark from a weathered tree. We are withdrawing to high orbit. The fleet will hold position but will not descend below the atmospheric boundary. Continue your survey if you believe it is safe. I want a full report. Understood, Commander. Yale watched the family disappear into the forest, three figures moving through green-gold light between rows of fruit that fed a world, walking on soil that had taught itself to breathe through poison, beneath a canopy that regulated an atmosphere at planetary scale. They walked the way people walked when they were home, when the ground beneath them was theirs in a way that no military force could ever make a claim to. They had not inherited this garden. They had grown it, cell by cell, root by root, from nothing. The root network beneath Yale's feet hummed once. Gentle, acknowledgement perhaps, or perhaps just the normal pulse of a planetary nervous system going about its day. The vibration spread outward in all directions, through the root systems, through the great trees, through the soil that had once been death and was now the most productive biomass in the galaxy. It was the sound of a world breathing. The sound of 11 billion people connected to their planet at a level no Serath engineer could comprehend. Oren was already walking toward the greenhouse, his scanner out, his earlier fear replaced by the hunger of a scientist confronted with something that rewrote everything he knew. Thea was taking atmospheric readings at 5-meter intervals, mapping the gas exchange gradient between the canopy and the clearing. They were scientists. They could not help themselves. Yale stood at the clearing's edge and looked up through the canopy gap at the pale blue sky above. Somewhere up there, the Serath fleet hung in high orbit, full of soldiers and administrators and bureaucrats who had come to survey a dead world and file their reports and go home. They would go home. They would file their reports. And in those reports, they would have to write the truth. That 60,000 years of military supremacy, 60,000 years of confident empire, 60,000 years of filing termination reports and moving on to the next world, all of it, meant nothing to a people who measured time in root growth and harvests, and the slow accumulation of living soil above dead salt. She knelt and placed her palm flat on the ground. The earth was warm. The roots hummed beneath her hand, not a warning, not a threat, a heartbeat, the slow, steady pulse of a world that had been murdered and had refused to stay dead, not through weapons or fleets or orbital platforms, but through the one thing no military doctrine could answer: patience and a single seed that became a planet. She stood. She brushed the soil from her knees. She looked at the greenhouse one more time, ancient and moss-covered and still in use after 60,000 years, still receiving new pots, still growing new things, still testing and learning and adapting. The woman with the clay pot had not brought a weapon or a shield or a warning. She had brought a plant, because that was what her people did. That was what they had always done. That was what they would still be doing when the Serath Dominion was dust, and its termination reports were forgotten by everyone, except the soil that had learned to eat them. Oren, Yale said, I want a full genetic analysis of the root network organisms. I want to know how they metabolize the salt compound. I want to know the complete speciation tree inside the greenhouse. And I want to know what is written on those tags. It will take weeks. We have time. They had 60,000 years. We can spare a few weeks. She walked to the greenhouse and looked through the condensation-fogged glass at the newest pot, the one the woman had just placed. It sat on the second shelf between two older specimens, its leaves small and pale and new, just beginning to unfurl. The tag beside it bore writing in a script Yale could not read, but she could see that it was short. A few characters, a name perhaps, or a date. Or perhaps just a number. The next number in a sequence that had been counting upward for 60,000 years. Each seed a digit. Each planting an increment. Each new greenhouse in each new clearing another column in a calculation so vast that only a species with the patience to measure time in millennia could have conceived of it. She looked at the forest stretching away in every direction, each row a different equation solved, each tree 1,000 years of accumulated carbon, each meter of soil a victory over salt won so slowly that no enemy could have noticed it happening until it was already complete. The mathematics of patience, the algebra of refusal, the long division of a species that had been reduced to zero and had divided that zero by persistence until it became infinity. The fleet would leave. It always left. That was what impatient things did. They arrived with force, made their mark and departed, confident in the permanence of destruction. But soil remembered, roots remembered. And a seed planted in dead ground by hands that refused to believe in permanent death, that was the kind of memory no fleet could burn, no salt could reach, no termination report could file away. 60,000 years, one greenhouse, one seed. A planet answered back.